Tēnā koutou, kua haere mai nei e tēnei ata, and welcome to Farming for the Future panel discussion. I ngā kai kōrero, Teanau, Mike, Anita, Brendan, tēnā koutou. I ngā mema paremata, tēnā koutou. I ngā manuhiri, tēnā koutou. I ngā mema rōpū kākariki, tēnā koutou. Ko Elizabeth McKenzie, tuku ingoa, he kai kaunihera aho, ki te ka kaunihera tai o ki Waitaha. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm just welcoming the panellists, members of Parliament, guests, and Green Party members to our Farming for the Future panel discussion. I'm Elizabeth McKenzie. I'm a Regional Councillor representing South Canterbury, and I'll be chairing this event. So while people are joining the webinar, I'd just like you to type in your name and your affiliation or where you're from, so that everyone knows who's attending. And also I'd just let everyone know, because I'm in a rural area in Fairlie, my internet connection's not that stable. So don't be alarmed if I drop in and out. There'll be a few other people like myself. So I'm just going to open with a karakia. And the karakia is called Kia ora te marino. So you can say it with me if you already know it. Kia ora te marino, kia whakapapa pounamu te moana. Hei huarahi mā tātou i te rangi nei. Araha atu, araha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. So in English, this means, may peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, as a pathway for us all this day. Show love and respect to each other. So this webinar is being recorded, and you will see on the screen a New Zealand Sign Language interpreter. We've got Phillipa and Amy. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom, the chat function is at the bottom of the screen. You can message everyone, or you can message the panelists and hosts only, or other people privately. So when you send your questions, just put 3 little stars and put question in front of your questions. It makes it much easier for us to pick up your questions. So what we're going to have in this event, we're going to have 2 rounds where each panelist will speak for a few minutes on the topic. And then they'll have a chance to respond to each other, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So what this discussion is about, we're discussing the opportunities and solutions for creating resilient food systems that support our farmers and growers and protect our land and water, as well as dealing with the climate crisis. So here's an example from the Regional Council. A few weeks ago, we had a farmer from Banks Peninsula, and he came to give a deputation to our council. He said he wanted to fence the land on his farm so he could allow natural forest regeneration. But when he worked out how much it would cost, he simply could not afford to do it and pay his bills. So he asked the Regional Council for help. Our staff are helping him to apply for funding, but there are actually very few funding options that he can apply for, and they're many and varied, and they're sort of all over the place. Since the late 1980s, our farmers have pretty much been at the mercy of the global economy. They've lost government protections and tariffs, and they exist in a system that pushes entire nations to over-specialise in the production of specific goods, often to the detriment of their own local economies. In reality, we have already become the dystopian nations of the Hunger Games. So in the past, our farmers used to receive advice on how to farm from government, from farm advisors, but now they receive a lot of information from the agrochemical companies who pay for much of the advertising in our rural newspapers. Our farmers are also trying to feed an overpopulated world, and as a result, they're farming beyond environmental limits. Many local farmers have told me they want to try new ways of farming, but they are worried about the risk of changing what they do. They want to meet other farmers who are doing these new ways of farming. And more importantly, they want to actually see the balance sheets to see if they can still pay their bills. So this discussion is about what we can do to change the situation, what we can do to break the cycle, to transition to a future where we're farming within our environmental limits and not beyond them. It's not about blaming or shaming. It's about constructive suggestions and solutions to the problems that we face. So I'm going to hand over to our panellists. Our panellists are the Green Member of Parliament, Teanau Tuiono, and Dr Mike Joy, Associate Professor Anita Wreford, and Brendan Hoare. So I'm just going to pass over and ask our panellists to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Teanau.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, ki rongi ngā āhuatanga o te wā, tata no e chaki ana tō tātou nei taiao. Kia ora everyone, my name is Teanau Tuiono, and I just wanted to acknowledge everyone that is out there doing the best that they can do for our environment. I'm a Green Party MP and spokes for agriculture, along with a whole lot of other things as well. I also live out in rural Manawa too, and I'm sitting pretty close to the Wi-Fi. I'm in my lounge at the moment, so if my Wi-Fi goes down, it means the whole valley's gone out. So just wanted to acknowledge all our rural people there who know what that's about as well. So kia ora, it's great to be here.
So Brendan, would you like to go introduce yourself next?
Sure, kia ora tātou, my name is Brendan Hoare. I'm with my company BuyPure New Zealand. I've got a long history in the organic sector in New Zealand. I really look forward to discussing things today. Thank you.
And Dr Wreford, would you like to go next?
Kia ora koutou, I'm Anita Wreford. I'm based at Lincoln University. I have most of my research focuses on climate change, particularly a focus on the impacts of climate change on our agricultural systems. So also looking forward to the discussion today.
And Dr Mike Joy.
Yeah, I'm Mike Joy. Kia ora everyone. I'm a senior researcher at the moment for the Institute of Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University in Wellington, and freshwater ecology is really my field, but I've had to broaden out. And I live in an urban area. I live in Paikakariki, and my broadband is unstable as well, and I've just had that notice come up, so I don't think it's just in the country.
All right. So we're just going to have sort of two main questions here. So I'm just going to ask the first question for each of our panelists to go around. And then after that, we're going to have questions from the audience. So I'm just going to ask if each of you could share the immediate opportunities and solutions that you see for the agricultural and farming sector. And I'm just going to start with Professor Anita Wreford.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay, well, I guess my work, I come from an economics and a social science background, so my answer is going to be, I guess, in that vein. And I think thinking about immediate opportunities, the one that jumps out to me initially is there's a real recognition globally and in New Zealand that agriculture has an impact on the environment. So there's a much greater awareness of the climate change contribution of meat and dairy, for example. And in New Zealand, people are also very concerned about the water quality and things like that. So people are making different choices about their food. And I think this is where there is an opportunity to shift into systems that have a lower impact on the environment, but also getting recognition for those producers that do make those changes. And how do we do that? I mean, I think organic certification is one option, but it's not for everyone. So I think that's an area we need to have more focus on. Thinking just in the climate change area as well, there might be some opportunities in terms of shifting suitability to be able to grow different products in different areas, but I'm always hesitant to talk about too many opportunities when we come to climate change. And the third one around climate change that I just thought of, I think we did have an opportunity to be a global leader in the climate mitigation space, emissions reduction, because we've put a lot of effort into this. It's a big issue in New Zealand. But just hearing Rod Orum's comments from COP26 in Glasgow yesterday, he was saying that, you know, Fonterra wasn't really at the table when the big dairy companies were announcing their commitment to reducing emissions. And so I feel like we might be losing that potential advantage. So thank you.
All right. So Brendan, do you have any comments on this?
Well, thank you. So I'm just going to, I think for me, it's about recognising where we are in time and space. So there's major civilization transition. We've got ecological and biological collapse. We've got mass migration, not so much since COVID, but got people moving a lot all over the world for all sorts of different reasons. And our behaviour largely as a civilised, well, as humans, has been foolish, on the edge of being in folly. We don't recognise the destruction going on. And one of the things I recognise in preparation for today is I was just working out, actually, I had a major sort of realisation, it happened to be in 1984 as a young man living on the East Coast, of this absolute destruction going on around soil, pesticide, fire. I was quite conscious of the destruction in the oceans, and I felt really compelled that we had to do something about that. And it was really off a book that really helped me understand. It was a book called Farmers of 40 Centuries. I consider it part of a trilogy for me personally around transformative books about. So I actually spent time, 6 years of my life, exploring in the world people who've lived in the same place for 4,000 years and how they do that, right? And the solution of this is partly that there's this indigenous traditional cultural knowledge, which we've decided to get rid of, and that in the short term, with a phrase we all know, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden, but we don't know how. Well, I think we do, but there's a reluctance to actually appreciate what that might be. So in many ways, I do believe that New Zealand can make a difference. I absolutely believe that. Not because we're smarter, brighter, faster, or anything like that, but because we're very, very simple. We've got simple politics, we've got simple people, we've got a very relaxed lifestyle in general. And that's our opportunity, and others recognise us to do something about that. But we've got to be wickedly organised, So interestingly, 20 years ago, as part of with the Soil and Health, we actually did organise a series of conferences of how the country could actually transition and move. And I think this is where we need to get back to. So in conclusion, we do need to be in sort of more action mode. I sent a text to James before his departure to Scotland, and I was halfway through and I asked my son, who's 15, I said, if you could talk to James now, what would you tell him? And he said, my son Quinn said, spend as much money on COVID and all that promotion and activity as on climate change. So that's from a 15-year-old telling us that we need to change and get out of this mythology that we've left the industrial age, but we're still trapped into that mythology that we feed the world, that we're big and better and all of that. It's an absolute nonsense. That's part of that folly. And I really, really feel that it is actually, we need to recognise and address our errors immediately and be very clear and honest. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Brendan. Teanau.
Yeah, kia ora. I mean, I think there is nothing but opportunity for us here, and we have to take that. I mean, the future is demanding for us to do that as well. And I was just kind of listening to what Brendan was saying, and I was thinking about this whakatauki, which was te anga whakamua me aro whakamuri. So, like, in order to move forward, we have to consider what happened before in the past. And my background is actually working with Indigenous peoples movements. So I've worked, all around the world, in Latin America and Africa, around the Pacific as well, and sort of working with people who have continuously worked with the environment and worked with the land. And I do feel that those principles are still here, and it's about trying to sort of hold on to that, taking that holistic view of what it means to be connected to the land, but also to the environment, and acknowledging the place of Māori in this as well. And I was just reflecting on a couple of things within our own space, within the Greens as well, recognising the role that Māori organics and the people that are really passionate about that space and our whānau that work in there, and knowing that it's not just about the kai, it's also about the community. And some of that kōrero came out in the organics strategy launch that came out yesterday as well. So I do feel that we are all moving in the same direction, but trying to find those ways where we can actually create change, put pressure when we need to put pressure is kind of the strategic questions that we need to ask. And I've only been an MP for a year now, but often I get up and I'll ask all these questions about where is the support to help farmers move to more regenerative practices, where is the support to provide for organic farmers, where is that? And often that stuff just doesn't get any pickup as well, as opposed to some of the other issues, like if I want to wear a tie or not. So for me, I guess it's trying to sort of see where everybody is at, where everybody is coming from, and trying to find a space where I could best support people to do that, but then finding ways to actually amplify that. Because when you get that, that's when we can actually get some change, because you put pressure on all of those points where we need to actually free up resources to help people to transition, to make people really have a really close look around synthetic fertilizers, what it actually means when we import supplementary PKE into the country, and what that means for rainforest people in Indonesia and in Malaysia and other places like that. These are the strategic questions that I have, but from those strategic questions, that's where our opportunities will come up from in terms of getting some stuff done. Kia ora.
Thanks, Tiana. Mike.
Hi. Yeah, well, I kind of, it's the good being last on the list here because I can respond to some of the things that the other people have said. But starting with you, Elizabeth, when you talked about feeding the world and the pressures that go on to us, I think, Brendan touched on this, we have to really question. A big chunk of our exports is dairy that we dry with coal, that we export to either replace breast milk or the most of it goes as a junk food supplement, a cheap filler for junk food. Is that feeding the world? That's a crucial question we have to ask ourselves, because I feel that we're taking a lot of hits for not much gain, and I feel that the future with the multiple crises, Brendan touched on this as well, climate change is far from the only issue that we have coming at us. I'm not even talking about COVID, I'm talking about all of the other problems that we've got coming at us, and there'll have to be some kind of rationalization of the amount of rubbish that we shift around the world that is unnecessary, and we'll have to start thinking about need versus want, and can we carry on doing this? So we've got these multiple existential crises coming at us, and when it comes to food choice, as an option, then say, oh, I want to choose a healthy option. I don't think, we could feed New Zealand on some tiny proportion of the land that we have here. It's the export market, and whether people will make choices, and they certainly can't make a choice when it's just a commodity white powder that we're creating. So the opportunities are to redesign our food production system, and I don't think it's tweaking what we have, and that goes for everything, for climate change and everything we're doing. We're not even rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. We're not even shifting the ashtray on one of the tables on the deck of the Titanic. We're just putting it off. And so we have to realize there's serious change that has to happen here. Tiana talked about, where's the support for change? I don't really think we need to support people to change. We need to stop subsidizing the harmful processes that we do at the moment. We've got a system that's dependent on fossil fuels. We subsidize the hell out of it indirectly by not making the polluters pay for the harm that they're doing. So I can give you these fantastic examples for Lake Rotorua and Lake Taupō, where we pay farmers to get the cows off the land there. We're paying we taxpayers are paying $400 a kilogram of nitrate bleached on those two lakes to save those, just to stop those two lakes from getting worse. And if we applied that same figure just to Canterbury alone, that would be $12 billion we'd have to pay. Or, in other words, we are subsidizing harmful practices to the tune of $12 billion in Canterbury alone, when the whole industry is supposedly worth $13 billion to it. It's those kind of crazy inequities that we have to think about. And then, there's a groundswell of movement. We just take that so, take those subsidies away from harmful stuff, and the good stuff will come springing up out of the ground, like grass, actually, if we would just get the covers off it and stop protecting this harmful system. And then there's just so many options for regen farming, for permaculture based farming, and much better profits for and lifestyles and outcomes for the rest of New Zealand from changing the way we do it. And it's just so simple, but we have to do some radical changing and stop thinking that we can tweak these things. Thanks.
Yeah, very good points there. So our next question is kind of similar to the first one, and some of the points have actually been addressed in the first question, but it's more action oriented. So our second question is, well, what action do you think needs to be taken to shift Aotearoa or Te Waipounamu towards sustainable agriculture? Who would like to go first on that? Okay, well, we'll start with Teanau.
Yeah, I mean, I think phasing out synthetic fertilizers is a good thing. We've been pushing this week in the House. There was a report which came out from Greenpeace Indonesia about the impact of PKE. So I asked some questions in the House about that, and the minister was, well, if it's causing because the question was around the deforestation in Indonesia, and I actually know some people from those communities. I've been to the Borneo jungle as well, and knowing that it actually intensifies dairy practices as well. So let's look at banning that as well, because it's a double whammy. You know what I mean? So it's on one hand it's causing deforestation in Indonesia, displacement of indigenous peoples and impact on wildlife habitats, but also it's exacerbating those processes here in Aotearoa New Zealand as well, along with synthetic fertilizers. And then if you look at things like blood phosphate, the harm that's causing in places like Western Sahara as well, that also adds that other dynamic on that as well. So that's definitely one thing I think we need to be doing as well. And whether that's like a levy or a tax or one of those sorts of things. So I agree with what Mike was saying. We need to be able to remove those things in order for these, so that people, when they do their farming and do their work, do it within the environmental boundaries that we have. And I think that's really important as well. But then I think there needs to be some support around for communities who are looking at food sovereignty. And I know, talking with a lot of Māori communities, that's their perspective. It isn't about making a profit. It's about trying to build that resilience around the community, around hapu and whānau, so that they don't have to go up the road down to the supermarket, and they can help to support and feed themselves. And I think that's something that's really important to do as well. So yeah, those are two things.
Okay, so Anita, did you want to share your perspective on this?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the interesting discussion so far. I'm just thinking, as you've all been speaking, I guess, about what I can add to this. So I think that I agree that we need transformative change in our systems. And also, yeah, I know climate change isn't the only issue, but it's the one I'm particularly familiar with. So from that perspective, it's clear that we really need to transform what we do, so that we can continue some of our production into the future. And I think, things around regenerative agriculture and more diverse systems will have multiple benefits, not only for reducing our emissions, but also making us more resilient to the changes in future, as well as potentially water quality and biodiversity and things like that. But so I'm definitely on the same page, but I guess some of my work involves talking to farmers who have, that they've, I guess, made their decisions in the political and economic environment that was around at the time. And rightly or wrongly, many of them are kind of locked into the system through the levels of investment and debt that they've made. And, cumulatively, this is not good. But there are human people at the end of these transformations. And I think we need to, I guess, for me, it's important to work together with all the communities involved to bring them alongside, and so that they feel that they are supported through this transformation. I mean, Elizabeth, you were talking about that farmer who came to you that they wanted to make these changes, but they just didn't have the money to do that. And I think for those people who don't have those financial resources, they're going to be left behind, both in terms of reducing emissions and being very vulnerable to future regulations and climate changes. So that does concern me a little bit. I think in terms of action, I think at a higher level, it's really critical that we have joined up policies across the different areas. So we've got agriculture, environment, we've got urban planning, soils, and they're all kind of coming into conflict with each other and undermining each other. And that Teanau, I think, would be really good if that could be sorted out at a higher political level. And I guess the final point is economic studies they all show that delaying action just makes it more painful in the long term. So we really need to start making changes now, because we've seen that with climate change. We put it off, and now we're hitting crunch time and people still don't know what to do, can't afford to do it. So we need to start acting now. Thanks.
Okay. Mike.
Yeah, I think that just Anita, said it just at the end there, and it's really, we had a really good example of it just before we came online. Teanau saying how something's not his portfolio, it's somebody else's portfolio, and that is a big part of the problem, is that we silo these issues, and we've got a ministry of this and a ministry of that, and nobody, joining up all of the dots. We talk about greenhouse gas emissions, then a whole lot of scientists want to go off and come up with some kind of gene to stop methane production by ruminants. And, so all the money goes into that, and that would fix, if it worked, one part of a very complex set of issues that come from that type of farming. Whereas if we de-intensified by making those costs go, and I really want to make sure that I make it clear that I'm not blaming farmers in any way at all. I've got some great mates who are dairy farmers. I was a dairy farmer. I understand the pressure that's on them. It's not the farmers are, if anyone, are the victims in this process, and it's the industry that's driving so much and has so much power in this. So I think somehow, getting away from, and scientists are guilty of it as well, as siloing themselves into areas and then not being able to see across it. We need somebody to be able to look across these things. Teanau touched on the Indigenous knowledge, and I think that's crucial to our future as humans on this planet, as we've forgotten so much in this excitement over thinking we're really clever, and modern Western processes where it's actually just been a big fossil fuel driven binge. We think we're really smart, but the Green Revolution was just all about taking energy from the past and turning it into food today, and that we're only starting to see the impacts of that now. So the solution has got to be, and I'm going to keep hammering this home, is leveling the playing field. And I never thought I would say this, but I've come to understand it now, that as a freshwater ecologist working at the coalface in New Zealand for 20 years now, the only actions that have actually resulted in some improvement, well, actually in a halting decline, is where we've paid those farmers, the examples that I gave of paying farmers not to farm. And the crucial thing to understand is it's an indirect subsidy that I outlined, because the costs are not being paid. So therefore the community is paying them, or the kids are paying them, because no one's actually fixing them. But if you pay farmers to get cows off the land and change land use, it's a one-off cost. If we don't do anything, then it's $12 billion every year. It's a cost one-off, fixed, done, let's get on with it. Whereas if we just let it go on, then we just build up harm into the future in the same way we do with the climate. So yeah, we have to face some tough realities that we have to be, we've had it too good for too long, and we need to change how we all live. And I'm not saying only farmers have to do that. We all have to change.
Thanks, Mike. And finally, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think it's profoundly simple. We're teeming with solutions, actually. A lot of them have been repressed and oppressed. And I work in a community that has experienced that for over 80 years, demonstrating and showing examples. And it starts with us trying to be a lot more, truthful, enabling trust and authenticity, fessing up, a bit of redemption maybe, of being honest. And, I work with a community that's maximas profoundly simple. It's health, oranga nuku, oranga kai, oranga tangata, healthy soil, food, people. I mean, that's how simple it is. But I'm going to bleat on about shifting from this industrial age or this industrial culture. The language has to stop. Language is really powerful. The language we use is what we think. And I think we need to move into a far greater biological, ecological consciousness. I think equal threat, whatever you might call climate change, is a biodiversity collapse. And that starts from seed in the field through to whole systems. So we need to start developing new indices. And I think one of the key things culturally are at the industrial age, not only the industrial age, but humans have a history of wanting to love playing boss and God. We start telling nature what's good for herself. And so we need to reconnect. So I've explained my whole world is working with the organic community, both commercially, in trade, right down to grassroots level. And what's driving the fastest growing multi-food sector in the world, right, double figures year on year, is the organic sector, is people wanting to reconnect with their food and the producer. And that's what's happening with Bunnings and Mitre 10 today. Seedlings and seed is going off, pouring out the door. People are wanting to reconnect with their own health again. So we need to, there's a real moment of change here. So solutions, I think they also include, we just follow the leader. Like I said, we don't have to reinvent anything. Around the world, there's some great initiatives. The EU just started, 50% reduction of emissions, 50% reduction in pesticides, 20% reduction in fertilizers. Simple, done. And as Mike and others are saying, we can find ways to do that. We used to pay farmers to cut down and burn forest. So we can do the opposite, pretty simple. So it needs to happen at all scales. By the way, there's no qualifications in New Zealand for organic. There's a diploma at Lincoln, a certificate program, no degrees, no masters, no doctorates, no postdoctorate. We have stripped the sector out of capacity to change. So we really need to be doing that. And we do need to, this is a point for the political part, tidy up our regulations and support policies and redirect budgets now, not tomorrow, or wait some other day. So it sort of feels like to me that we're sort of planning a trip to the tropics, but we're actually sailing to Antarctica. We've got to turn the boat around and move it very quickly and cultivate this connectivity. So we need literacy, not only in English, Māori and sign, but we also need literacy in ecological, biological thinking and the systems that go with that. We need training in systems thinking and critical theory, and dare I say it, wisdom, and understanding the simple logic, profound truth that it's really simple, the things we need to do. You cannot put poison on the land or on food, put it in your mouth and expect to be healthy. That's just dumb. So, and finally, most important, it's got to be serious fun. So it's got to be a cultural activity change, a culture of enjoyment, a culture of celebration, and it's got to be serious fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Teanau, you've got something to add.
I was just kind of agreeing with everybody, what everyone was saying, the opportunities with organic, for me are very obvious as well. And when we were doing our Farming for the Future campaign during the election, we had this $300 million idea of helping farmers to transition to regenerative farming practices. But I was just thinking about that $12 billion subsidy that Mike was talking about as well. And I'm just trying to think of ways to help support farmers to help them to do that. And I was wondering if, like in the mechanics of it, were you thinking about finding ways to work with banks to sort of ease off the debt? Because I know talking to some folks, they got into hock because of the big dairy boom and so on and so forth. So some folks want to move, but they can't because they're all stuck on it. So would the mechanism, would you see that as is that something to do with regulating debt or supporting it in that way, or were you thinking about it in another way? Sort of generally, I'm interested in what you think there, and maybe Professor Anita Wreford might have some good ideas there.
Tiana, I think we've got the example already from Rotorua and Taupo. The farmers have been paid, so they're big chunks of money. That's $40 million for a handful of farmers in Rotorua and 90 million for Lake Taupo, and there wasn't that many. It's like debt is a huge issue for the industry, and that's something that has to be dealt with. But the solution of that I suggested, that you pay to stop the harm, then the debt issue doesn't really come into it then.
I guess just
all right, Anita?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I mean, so I know that in the climate change area, banks are really interested in their lending, and particularly around climate risk. But there are also, I can't give you details, but certainly interest in changing the lending conditions depending on farming practices. So that's one kind of private sector mechanism. People alluded to the fact that we're used to subsidise farmers, and the EU can achieve many of these things because they pay the farmers to do it. I used to work in the UK, and there are great schemes, and yeah, the farmers get paid. So in New Zealand, either we need to question whether it is time to go back to some form of subsidy for certain types actions that we want to see. But that would be a big debate, because we've gone very much in the opposite direction. And there are other kind of economic instruments that could be looked at. We have the ETS, it hasn't been very successful, but that doesn't mean that those kind of trading schemes are always unsuccessful.
And Brendan, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, we can't miss tenure. Who gets to farm? I mean, these are complicated, including labour. Who wants to farm? I mean, at the moment, the whole primary sector's turned its back basically on a lot of community. People don't want to farm, they don't want to go, they don't want to reconnect. They don't actually. There's this disconnect with food, and don't forget that actually the development is with the customer. I think one of the myths that New Zealand's driving in is that we're still very farmer-centric. There is a customer at the end of the day, and we've got to communicate with the customer all the time. And, trade's an issue too. But those customers are often offshore, and they know our pants are down increasingly. So together, there's those trade, there is debt, but there's also tenure, labour, there's a whole raft of issues. So that's why I just think it needs to be quite a profound change. And I'd love a political party to lead that really strongly, like the Greens. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. So I think what I'm hearing from everyone is basically we need a top-down and a bottom-up approach. We need not just to change our policies, but we need to change our minds and the ways that we're thinking. So I'll just move on. I've got here, if I understand correctly, just correct me if I'm wrong, Rosalie, we're going to be taking questions from the audience now. And so I'm just going to start with, we received a couple of questions prior to this event, and I'm just going to start with those. There's a whole bunch of questions coming in which are currently being collated, and I'll go on to those soon. So the first question I've got here is from Maria, and she says, many small and family organic farms are struggling to survive and either depend on significant capital input from other sources of income and or accept wages for owner-operators that are below minimum wage rates. In theory, it's these farms that are at the core of local food sovereignty and environmental protection. How would the panelists like to see these farms being supported in order for them to pay themselves and their workers a dignified wage? So, Tiana, did you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things the government could do, and I have asked that in one of those really, really late sessions in the House, was around preferential procurement. It was actually after discussion I had with Brendan. And so, like, if you had if organic farmers, particularly these family ones, if they had a guaranteed income or stream of really healthy, nutritious kai going into a particular place, then that would help them. That would help them financially, because I know that that's always going to be there. And I was just thinking about some of those programs trying to get good kai into schools. If that kai was organic and they were working with those local producers to actually get that kai there, that helps those schools, but also helps those organic farms as well, who are doing all of the things that we want them to do as well. But that was one idea, and there's probably a whole lot of others.
Tiana, I'm sorry if I just asked a question on this, but I think one of the issues with trying to get those local producers hooked in is that we've got a bunch of laws at the moment which actually say that we have to open it out to the free market.
Yeah.
So how would government address that problem?
Well, I mean, if the preference was there for organics, then that would help to deal with some of that. But I'm certainly open to any other suggestions that folks think that we could be taking and asking those questions. Yeah.
Okay. So who would like to go next, or shall I just Anita? Do you have anything to say on the question?
Sure why you picked me. It is a bit out of my area of expertise. I think unless we were going to look back at sort of government support for that kind of thing, I think it needs to be sort of those innovative local community support. I for example, there's this person, Happy Cow, who's tried to do his milk production differently, and you can pay him a certain amount each month to keep him going. I mean, these aren't, I guess, not widespread and scalable kind of solutions, but I think if we did want to have those more at scale kind of production, we would need a higher level of support. So I don't want to repeat what I said earlier.
Okay, Brendan, I see you've still got your hand up. Did you want to comment?
I lowered it. I mean, this is one of the cores of our company, what we do. I mean, we're certified as Organic Farm NZ, which is a local domestic program which the Greens helped get the funding for 20 plus years ago now. Look, this is a combination of what I would call, we don't have a food culture in New Zealand for a start, right? If you were to name our cultural food, I mean, we do have hangi, and then what? So we don't actually have a food culture now that's growing very fast. There's actually quite a big movement domestically and in local government, which is support, but we've also got to unleash the human spirit that's quite enterprising. I mean, I think one of the key things here is that there is this entrepreneurial spirit. People love creating and being creative and applying their craft, but we are reliant on the supermarkets. There's two. There's a duopoly now. That's in government at the moment. But there is always opportunity for enterprising, and there's some people doing that are actually, Tiano, some really good examples of, especially with Organic Farm NZ, enterprising businesses supplying local cafes, multiple channels. And what we've been able to do is help companies slowly grow, support families, intergenerational income. This sort of, it's about self-belief too. So that's kind of being stripped out of us, that you've got to be a certain scale and a certain size, because that's part of the industrial mythology, particularly in pastoral agriculture. It's all about size. How big you are, how many, head of cattle you have, or whatever it might be, how big your tractor is, how big your debt is. People are very proud of those things. And so we've got to create this local food culture. That's really, for me, I think it's on the wings, ready to come in. We just need the right prompt.
Thanks, Brendan. Mike, you've got your hand up on this one.
I just wanted to suggest that we tax the hell out of rubbish food, and we import a surprising amount of food we import into this country that probably the base products came from here in the first place, went somewhere overseas, got turned into junk food, and then came back again. So we could tax that to fund dropping the GST on you know, nutritious, healthy food, and it would not just be good for the environment and for local small farms and all that kind of thing, but really big improvements in the health system as well. I spoke at a thing at Parliament last week, the evidence-based eating group of physicians in New Zealand and public health people, you know, and it's the gains, the health gains and the money that could be saved in the health system by getting rid of junk food out of our diets would be amazing, and to be able to use that money to support small local farms and that, you know, and producing good food would be a really good way of doing it, I think.
So you're suggesting health tariffs or environmental tariffs or emissions tariffs, or
no,
are you suggesting more of a tax?
I just think that, okay, take the GST off the healthy food and put more tax on junk food. I think it's quite easy to delineate those, you know, what's junk and what's not. Experts can do that and just have a, you know, it would fund itself that way, and that way our local producers would have such a big advantage over the cheap junk, because the cheap junk's cheap because they're not paying the costs or the, you know, the real wages or the harm that's being done in some other country. So we could even it up that way.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but most of our McDonald's is actually farmed and produced in New Zealand. So yeah,
I wasn't thinking of McDonald's. I was.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking of.
Sorry.
No, I didn't mean fast food. I mean like they just go through the supermarket shelves. There's so much of it is rubbish. Yeah.
All right, Teanau.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that duopoly as well. And I mean, like I think one idea will come forward, and I'm not into it, is that we just introduce in like a third market, so it becomes a triopoly, if that's even a word. When I think what would be more useful is if we had an alternative way, so like a cooperative that supported healthy food and local growers and all that kind of thing, something that actually intervenes into that duopoly. Otherwise, you just end up becoming it's just instead of a duopoly, it's a triopoly, and it's just replicating the same old thing. So there is an opportunity there. I think widespread there is, you know, massive concerns about the duopoly as well, the way they're able to ratchet up the prices, and then of course because profit is the driving motive, they can do all those things with in terms of whether food is healthy and so on and so forth. But if you introduce another way to get healthy kai in, but make sure that it's cheap as well, that supports local growers and the diversity of kai within our region as well, that would be a better way to support a pathway for growers to actually get their kai onto the shelves in a way that will hopefully become more affordable for people and help them to also scale up as well. And then will also help to solve some of those issues around, you know, that earlier question that we had about some of these smaller family organic farms that are struggling to, you know, make headway because of all of the different sorts of pressures. But I think there's definitely an opportunity there that we should be pushing on. We mentioned it a couple of times in some press releases and so on and so forth with the Greens as well. But I think it would be very good for us to put a collective push on that, because that could be a way that we could deal with a lot of these different issues, because it could create this a really progressive space and help to really have that conversation about setting up a food system which we can be a lot more strategic about in terms of the way that we do all the things that we actually need to do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a question has come in which is related to our current discussion, and it's from Dot. And she says, how much do our international trade agreements tie us into importing cheap food produced overseas, for example, tomatoes or corn? So can anyone, perhaps Teanau, can you shed some light on this?
I don't have any numbers to hand, but I can definitely put that into a parliamentary written question and ask the Minister of Trade himself. Yeah, I mean, because the question asks itself really, if we're just importing cheap food, and then why aren't we growing it ourselves, the nutritious stuff as well? So that definitely answers itself. But I'm happily, if Dot wants more specific numbers, I'll ask him. I'll put it in, and we can then go from there. but I can.
That would be great. I
get
think
the sense
Anita and Brendan. Oh, sorry.
I get the sense, the feeling I know where that question is coming from, and I would agree with the sentiment.
Mm. Yeah, and I note that the Green Party was, I think, the only party who voted against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Am I correct on that?
I
yes.
organised some of the local marches here with
yeah, yeah, I was on one of those. Okay, so Brendan and Anita. So we'll start with Brendan. You were wanting to respond to Dot's question also.
Yeah, so we are also a certified organic exporter. So we help people who have product to sell offshore, unique products. So it's complicated trade negotiations because you don't get anything for free. So if we want electric cars, who's going to give them to us? Maybe Japan, and they find glyphosate in our honey. Funny that, isn't it? And that's how it works. They even find it in certified organic honey because glyphosate's everywhere. And this is the pressure our trade negotiators are under in a global economy where we just think, oh, big trade deals, the minister's just gone to the US and EU and a lot of dairy, as Mike's saying, so there's all this meat and dairy pouring into the US now because we got a good deal. It always comes, nothing's for free, right? No such thing as a free lunch. So that's part of that global economy we work with. We need to be quite conscious of that and that the strong arming that can go with that. And so hence the need to be, a culture, a food culture of I'm not really into self-sufficiency, but I do think self-reliance. You'll never stop people trading, ever. I think that's what humans do. We trade and exchange of goods and services and ideas and arts and culture. That's what we do. We're very good at it. We love it. And so, but we have to be self-reliant and be at least start that conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Anita.
Sorry. Yeah, I would just in response to that specific question, as far as I'm aware, our trade agreements don't lock us into importing certain amounts of particular products like tomatoes and things like that. And we export much more food than we import generally. But I think also trade has an important role to play, even if you're going to look at the whole carbon situation. We are quite efficient producers, so if people are going to buy meat and dairy, then maybe it is better than that they buy it from New Zealand. I know you all hate that argument, but it's still something to think about. And also trade plays an important role in smoothing out shortages due to climate changes or extreme events globally. I certainly would not want to see us moving out of trading.
Yeah, I think just something to emphasize here is that we export 92%, I think it is, of the food that we produce, and we only actually use 7% in New Zealand. So I guess one of those fundamental questions for government is, do we really need to be producing this much food? So there's another question on this topic, on the same topic. So I'll just read it out. And it says here, I appreciate Mike's point of view about the level of junk food and unhealthy food, but how do we deal with the power and influence of Fonterra? For example, the Heart Foundation is still recommending meat and dairy, which are known to lead to elevated cholesterol and unhealthy hearts. How do we reduce the power of big businesses? So,
yeah, well, it was really interesting because it came up at this evidence-based eating thing where the Ministry of Health guidelines actually ignore the science, and there are components like meat and dairy that are in the guidelines that there's no science whatsoever to support it. They should not be there. But that shows the power of the influence of that lobby in New Zealand. It's a hugely powerful, and I don't think anyone should for 1 second underestimate the power of the dairy, or not the dairy, but the agricultural industry. And I'm not talking about the farmers here, I'm talking about the industry. And you can see from the ETS through to the freshwater stuff that they get a free run on everything. And no matter what the advice is, then it will get turned down. So I don't know, I can't answer how you change that, but just be aware that it is incredibly powerful. And it does really affect policy in New Zealand. And just to come back to your numbers about 7% and 93%, again, I want to question what is food, because you're including dairy in that, and if it's junk food, if we actually saw the figures and percentages for healthy, nutritious food, that's actually feeding people and making them better, not worse in health, then we might see a difference in that. But sure, we're a low population, really, lots of land, and we should be producing lots of really good, healthy food to feed the world, and we could and should do that rather than what we've got caught up in.
I believe the term that we'd probably use for unhealthy food would be perhaps a food-like substance. So something that's not quite a food. Brendan, you want to?
This is a bit of a this is a pet topic of mine. I mean, I've lived really remotely in Asia where people who produce all their own food. It's a cultural diet. Good, wholesome food's really cheap if you have a whole culture and you know how to cook properly. And I did answer that in the thing. So there is, we need to teach cooking in school with a lot less soups, diets. There's a whole, we don't have a food culture, right? So that's one thing. The other really important one for us to think about culture, so I'm going to be beating on about this cultural, the dominant culture in New Zealand is a Christian pastoral culture. That's what dominates our worldview. The Lord is mine. We all know the answer to that. The Lord's not a forester or a forest and bird, food forest dude. No, it's a pastoral worldview that dominates, and they've got huge power. So the world has. We've got big business, big ag, big chem, big pharma, big data. So we have to be quite conscious that some of that, I would go as far as to say some of it's quite lawless, the behaviour, and it's got to stop. And I expect, this sort of sentiment I'm putting forward, I've seen a lot, right? I've been on the Unilever Sustainable Agricultural Advisory Board, right across, and you only have to do a bit of background reading to understand that is Mike's exactly right. That's the arm up the government's back, is the input providers and their GST. That's what provides the country and the government income. So they're not going to stop that. Where would the GST come from? So it's an insidious sort of situation we find ourselves in. So, but I'll just go back. It is, I think there are very simple solutions, and I'd love the Greens to really, Teanau, no pressure, really start harping on hard about this.
Okay. Teanau, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just kind of respond to that, how you deal with the pressures of big business, whether that's big ag, big data, or big anything really. I mean, we have to deal with it in the way that we've always dealt with it, and that's people's power. And that's organising right across in all the different spaces that we occupy, and finding those connections and building those synergies as well. And for me, two-tier Waitangi is the foundation for all of that. But I know that when you are building those connections, one of the hardest things to get to is points of clarity. What are the issues that we're really focusing on? Where are those actual pressure points? Where, when we're asking for funding and resourcing, where exactly do we need to put it? And so I guess like this is really useful for me, because it actually is helping to provide that clarity. Because like I see the Greens as our, we're we're one part of the puzzle. We're in Parliament, and we can do and push and do and be there and try to hold that space, and to ask and call for the things that need to be asked and called for within the confines that we have, and then just sort of doing what other people are doing as well. And there's a whole spectrum of action that we can take, and whether that's as elected representatives or within the NGOs, or as in hapu and iwi or whānau, or in food co-ops or organic co-ops or different communities of interest. It's finding those connections and finding that clarity right across, and trying to find where those mutual connections are, that we can leverage on, because that's what it takes when you're taking on big anything. When you're David and their 50, 100 Goliaths, that's what it takes to actually build those connections, and that's often quite a long conversation, sometimes an uncomfortable conversation, because some of us are all on a learning journey. I know I am, in terms of what you can and can't do within the confines of what you can do as well, and then trying to learn how you can push at those different boundaries and ask those questions that need to be asked. And I sort of see that as my role, learn to do that in Parliament setting.
Thanks, Tiano. We've got another question here. So 2 people have actually asked this question. Many of the above actions depend on central government action. Are there any actions possible at local government level that we can do? I'm wondering if
you might have to answer that question yourself.
Yeah. So yes, there are some things that we can do at local government level, because while there's a lot of things that we do which are statutory, which means the legislation says we have to do things a certain way, there are non-statutory things that we can do, so informal things that we can do. Of course, those sorts of things have limits and they tend to be at a smaller scale. But one of the things we can do is push on central government. And we can say, look, we really want this circular economy. We really want to be able to choose contractors that have, that pay a living wage, that have low emissions, environmentally sustainable, all these sorts of things. Or we want the ability to be able to purchase land, to retire land. We want the ability to actually have emergency powers in the face of the climate emergency. We can push on central government for these things. So yeah, we often cannot act quickly or immediately, except at a smaller scale. But we are doing as much as we can. So before I go on to Mike, Tiano, did you want to add anything to that?
What I think local government should be doing?
Yeah, from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to sort of see where the agents of change are, and central government is the big player. They regulate the big business and that kind of sort of thing. So pressure coming from our way is a good thing in terms of the questions that we should be asking, the noises that we should be asking as well, because there are those pressures from that side of the political spectrum, but unless we speak to it, then they get a bit of a free ride. Because often people say, well, look, those agriculture's getting a hallway pass, and I agree with that. And the question is that we now ask is, what do they do with the hallway pass? Do they do the things that we needed them to do because we're in a climate crisis and an ecological crisis with that hallway pass, or did they not do the things that they needed to do? And if they did not do the things that we needed to do, then we need to ask those uncomfortable questions. And I see it as part of our role in being able to push those sorts of things in Parliament as well. And I'm sure you guys are doing it at the regional and local level as well. Yeah,
those uncomfortable questions need to go in both directions. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Mike.
Yeah, I've got an uncomfortable one, because regional councils have utterly failed to enforce the regulations that they have, and so I throw it straight back at regional councils. I mean, look, in your region, the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, it's been going for how many years now? You have achieved about 1% of the things that were supposed to have been achieved. I've been involved in multiple court cases with Fish and Game and taking Horizons to court to try and to get them to apply to enforce their own plan change regulations on intensive farming, and you have to take them to court to get them to do it, and then you win 3 times in a row, and then they just change the plan so that they don't have to do it. We've got just endless examples of regional councils around the country failing to enforce the RMA, and that was quite clear under the pre-existing RMA that freshwaters should never have been allowed to be destroyed like they have been, and councils have failed to do it. So I throw it squarely at the council. So then if you don't enforce those things, then you like I come back to, you subsidize harmful practice, because if it's just pure business, isn't it? If you can get away with something and make money out of it, then why wouldn't you? And so if we didn't have any traffic cops on the road, do you think that people would drive at 50 k's? No, they wouldn't. That, you know, would be like it was in the 70s, and everyone just sped and drunk drive. So yeah, I think that we really, councils have failed and the system has failed, and you know, maybe it's a lack of good legislation coming from government and lack of support, but yeah, there's so much more that regional councils could do to help the problem, make the problem go away.
I agree with you, Mike. For example, at Canterbury, we've got a new council, and I think we're seeing this all over New Zealand, as people actually are starting to vote environmentally conscious people into councils. And so now we're faced with the situation of trying to unravel or undo a whole system and that was set up by previous councils. And so, you know, for example, we're putting this year a lot more money into our compliance monitoring enforcement, and we've got, you know, a lot more abatement notices and fines and all these things happening. Our statistics are starting to change. It's a very slow, you know, it's like turning a very big boat around. It's a very slow process.
Yeah, that's good
but
to
I think
hear.
As long as people continue to vote environmentally minded people onto those councils, then you will get that change. Brendan.
Look, my master's was in rural development and agricultural systems. We've alluded to it before. There's an agricultural lobby who are wickedly organised. They're better organised than we are. It's as simple as that. That's why they dominate the local government systems and push things through, because they've got the numbers and it's the status quo and they're funded. So we know, you know, and this is the sorts of, I was trying to allude, and what I was saying is sort of this, we need to understand the system we're operating in order to function. And the oppressed understand that because they see it every day in their lives. And we need to understand that the local government system is dominated by politics, of which the sort of wider green community has very little say in, period. So we've got to look at ourselves and say we're not organised enough in order to have effective change, and wear that, and then change the question around, so how do we get wickedly organised? Quickly, real quick. And that's a whole other discussion, but I think we need to at least acknowledge the framework in which this exists in, and who's got the money, who's got the power, and who's better organised than we are.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Brendan. And that lobbying's existing at local government as well as central government level. So yeah,
Elizabeth, that's just
sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, that's truth. We all know that, you know, like we go, oh yeah, I know that, and it's hard. It's so hard because it's extremely hard to recognise. But unless we recognise the issue and the hurt and the pain of that, then it's very difficult to us to operate effectively.
So I've got a question here for Anita from one of the audience, and they say, what economic instruments do you think would be most effective in encouraging farmers to reduce emissions and nutrient pollution of waterways?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, we did kind of skirt around it earlier. I mean, I think it depends on like the context and which particular emissions and which systems you're trying to look at. So I wouldn't want to sort of provide one blanket answer. I mean, so you've either got regulation or you've got kind of instruments, right? So I think actually in some cases regulation is what we really need, and it comes back to, I guess, the previous discussion. But in terms of economic instruments, well, we've got this massive ETS in New Zealand that currently doesn't include agriculture. And there's plans underway to see how we could incorporate agriculture in that. And I think trading schemes in theory can work, but I think when you've got so many small farmers based on biological systems, there's so much uncertainty, it's pretty challenging. So it's not an easy answer. We've got potentially taxing emissions as well, which is a slightly different form of that as well. I think, as I say, it's not an easy answer, so I feel like I'm rambling here, but we need to look at things case by case. I think probably greenhouse gas emissions are different from freshwater emissions as well. And underneath it all, we do need regulation. But it's something that we could look at more, like water pricing, for example. That was around, and then people became, I think, too scared of probably the lobbying and the concern around that. But that could be something we could look at in future as well. Sorry.
Thanks, Anita. This is not a question that's come up on my feed, but I just saw one pop up from Brian, and it said, could many of these things actually be solved by a single transferable voting system? So thinking big, I suppose. Teanau, what would you have to say about this?
Yeah, I'm all for it. You know, we have an MMP system, and for central government, single transferable vote is different, of course. But the more democratic a system is, the better. That's what I would say. Yeah.
All those small parties would perhaps start to pop up. So, Mike, you've got your hand up.
Oh yeah, just about, you know, you're sort of touching on democracy here, and I kind of wanted to mention my experience of, you know, campaigning for decades now about fresh water, and, you know, with a whole team of people in New Zealand, and we got to the point where we raised awareness so that New Zealanders said in multiple polls that 80% of New Zealanders said that it was their #1 environmental issue was fresh water, and a lot of pundits have said it was probably how National lost their 3-term run, and then we had the Labour coalition come in. So we gave the mandate, we gave this amazing mandate to parties to you know, act on fresh water, and then we had this whole, you know, essential freshwater package, and I was on the, you know, technical advisory group, and it was all sounding fantastic, and then the government, Minister Parker, capitulated and backed down on a whole bunch of the things that had been recommended. So I kind of lost my faith in this democratic process, and that we gave the strongest mandate ever, and yet it still didn't come through in the end. So that's why I've kind of lost faith, and maybe this will change and it'll come back again. But that was just my experience, just because I've been saying for years to students and at public events, you know, all you have to do is just, you know, government won't do it by themselves. You've got to give them the mandate, tell them what you want, they'll lead from, and they'll follow. But it didn't work in that case. So yeah, that's just an experience.
I was just wondering. I was wondering, Mike, because we got a whole lot of Māori wards that are coming on board. I mean, we've got a whole pile here within the central province where I live as well, and that will hopefully change the dynamic around at least the regional board and the city council, in terms of people that will have a understanding of what the mana whenua and tangata whenua have, and the mātauranga Māori perspective that many of them will bring in terms of fresh water. Do you think that will be movement in the right direction? What would you say the impact being with that in terms of the things that you've been advocating for in terms of fresh water at the regional council level and the local council level?
Yeah, I think that's the one hope that I do have, and I'm working with a number of iwi around New Zealand on those kind of things. And the one thing that did come through in the essential freshwater package was Te Mana o Te Wai, and that may be the saviour, in that depending on how it's interpreted, it may override you know, the other failings in the legislation, is that being able to use Te Mana o Te Wai. And I'm kind of, and there's also Ngāi Tahu's claim for freshwater management for their takiwā as well, which I'm you know, that's coming up next year. Also the water ownership, Waitangi Tribunal, Y2358, the water ownership claim. So potentially, you know, a lot of options there where Māori may be able to really turn this thing around.
So I've got a final question here, and it's from Maria. And she says, Maturanga Maori is not siloed. How could Te Tiriti or Waitangi be used to make our systems more holistic? So who would like to go first on this? Tiano?
Well, I could. I'm the only Māori here, I think. Well, no, I think definitely. If I think about tino rangatiratanga, the basis of that is respect for papa tuanuku. It's about that obligation that we have to whānau and hapu and iwi as well, and the recognition of, like in the case of Te Awa Whanganui, that the awa itself is a tipuna as well, as a relative, and understanding that these the intrinsic mauri and the life force of different aspects within the environment as well. I mean, it's premised on our culture. So like when we're teaching our kids their pepeha, we talk about, you're identifying your maunga, your awa, your whenua. Those things are physical things in the environment. You're identifying literally with that river, literally with that mountain, literally with that whenua. You are acknowledging that relationship. And so having that in there, it causes a whole lot of conversations, which are natural into Te Ao Māori. Would you pollute your tipuna? Of course you wouldn't. And if you're not going to do that, then because it's actually part of your fundamental values, that is something that I think is missing. And I think that's often the reason why, that's the main reason why we have found ourselves in the climate crisis and in the ecological crisis. And you might have heard it a few times, for those of you who've been tuning into the COP as well, many Indigenous activists saying, you know what, if you gave Indigenous peoples their land back, this would solve a lot of the issues, because then that holistic way of actually looking after the whenua and recognising those connections with the whenua, with the awa, with the ocean, with our rivers and our oceans would be intrinsic in the way that community would operate. And so it's important that we hold on to that. Yeah, it's about, it is about some of this other stuff and, the levers for trade and all that kind of stuff as well. But if we step back, those underlying values can actually hold us all in a way that recognises those connections, not only to ourselves and each other, but to other species as well. They don't become just these commodities that we trade and sell and so on and so forth. They become acknowledged as their own sentient beings as well. And I think that often misses in the conversation. And I can get caught up in it myself. It's the economic framing around the commodification around everything, as opposed to the other values that things in the environment have, the other values that animals have as well. And so I think if we step back and have a look at that and help that to sort of permeate the way that we do all the things that we need to do, I think that gives us that holistic view I think Mike was talking about as well. We often do get siloed. It's this and this, and I get stuck into this little corner over here, and actually the whole view is, the climate crisis is the biodiversity crisis, it's the income inequality crisis. It's all those things are all connected and so on and so forth. So holding on to that world view, which is easy from a Te Ao Māori perspective, because that's just how we roll, is really, really important, and not to sort of get caught going down the economic rabbit hole, if you like.
Great. Brendan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of just finishing a paper. It's a global piece of work, which included Nick Roscrooge, ethnobotanist from Massey, and Jessica Hutchings from Te Waka Kaiora, and Cherisella Stanku. Cherisella and I worked on it. It was a global piece of work looking at agroecology and Indigenous foodways. So, and what was a consensus globally is indigeneity offers us it's like a blessing, right? So it's not like we don't know, and it's also traditional. And yes, Māori, of course, are Indigenous here, but we have other Indigenous people. There's so much to learn from this global awareness and community around this interconnectivity. But one of the big, and it actually was quite contentious at the end, just to sort of put this in here, the communities from particularly Central and South America changed the title of the whole piece of work, Rejecting Regenerative Agriculture. They saw it for what it was big, what they called big white industrial practice shuffling in on agroecology and organic, what I've been doing for 80 years. Now, that might be quite contentious in this room, but where people, there is this dominant culture on us. I want to reiterate that. There is this dominant culture that's quite pervasive in our thinking that we need to break away from. So that paper is going to be ready in December. And I'll be very happy to share that to everybody once that comes out. It was a real pleasure to work with and work globally on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Anita.
Thanks. I was just going to add that I think it's really important that we acknowledge Mātauranga Māori alongside Western science, and I'm pleased to say that in academia, in some areas anyway, there is trying to understand and work together with local communities to, I guess, learn from and incorporate some of those, that much more interconnected, holistic view of our system. So just kind of agreeing with what was said.
That's an interesting observation, Anita. I'm a scientist, and when you study things like the microbiome, there's actually a huge amount of connection between the Maori worldview in terms of the concept of mauri and health, and the microbiome and how everything is connected in a way that we weren't previously aware of. But also what's interesting is that science has changed from being an amateur, a family activity into a professionalized thing. It's been commoditized. And I wonder whether this is also, whether we've lost some of our Pākehā roots in that way. We used to be foragers and fishers. We were herbalists. And some of that has it's been changed. So, yeah. So we're moving to the end of this discussion. And so I'm just going to ask everyone on the panel to make some final comments. And there are a lot of questions that have come through that we haven't been able to ask because we're limited for time. But what we're going to do is we're going to take those questions and follow them up with the panelists. I'll start off with Mike, if that's all right, if you've got any closing comments that you want to make.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just will come back to where I started, that the solution here is to even the playing field. We've drastically tilted the playing field in favour of industrial agriculture and its dependence on fossil fuels. And as soon as we start levelling the playing field by making the polluters pay for the harm that they do, then much better options will just come through automatically without any support, and people can easily do that.
Thanks, Mike. Anita, did you want to go next?
Sure. I guess my main closing kind of comment is thinking about we need to start acting now if we're not already, and so also supporting our producers and our communities, thinking about what we can do in the short, medium and long term to transform our systems, and also thinking about the idea of a just transition for everybody.
Thanks, Anita. Brendan.
Thank you. Yes, look, I'd like us just to remember that this is profoundly simple, as complicated as it is. And I do think we've all got answers in that Indigenous, traditional, classic way. And I know it's a phrase, but we are begging. I mean, all the work I do, understanding the market, people are just yearning to reconnect. It's deep. It's mind, body, soul, spirit reconnection. So I don't think we should wait for the big Olympic win. No one in this room has won an Olympic gold medal yet, and I doubt if any of us will. So often, we can all act locally and really get involved really strongly. And I do really think we need to have a really strong green voice on this, wickedly strong, very clear, and pertinent, and keep our finger on the nerve non-stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. And finally, Teanau.
Yeah, kia ora. I've really enjoyed the session. I like what Brendan was saying, that this is wickedly, complicatedly simple. And I just wanted to acknowledge, I certainly learned and picked up a lot from from folks around, looking holistically, but also sort of making sure that what we do is to do all the things as well. And I've been kind of flicking through some of the questions, and there's some wonderful questions on there. And if I can't answer them, I'm pretty happy to pile them into a parliamentary written question and get a minister to answer them as well. And I did see a comment from Stefan Browning, who was a former MP as well, around looking at Denmark and seeing that the way that they called for, I think, was it 20% movement towards organics as well. So I'll definitely look into that, Stefan, as well, and acknowledging that some of the comments that I made around the alternatives to the duopoly and breaking that up and having a space in there which is supporting local growers and organics and communities and so on and so forth, actually came from a Facebook conversation I had with Stefan as well. So definitely we'll look into that as well. But we've got another webinar next week as well. The conversation continues, and that's around the emissions reduction plan as well. I'll be doing that with Eugenie, and that'll be on next Sunday on the 14th of November at 2 p.m. And so the idea around that is all the discussions, all the things, all the sorts of questions that should be in an emissions reduction plan that the Minister of Agriculture should be taking on board. Let's poll that into submissions and put that forward to make sure that all the things that we need to do actually go to the places where we can actually start to begin to put pressure on. Thanks.
Thanks, Gianna.
In the chat, there's some more details from Rosalie.
Great. So I'd just like to thank everyone for attending this webinar and encourage everyone to act locally and get politically active. Try and support our farmers. They're in a tricky spot. And even little things that you do will actually make a big difference. And if you want to, you can put some final messages into the chat. So I'm just going to close with a karakia, and I'll say it in English afterwards so that you know what I've said. Ka whakairia te kōrero, ki te tahu o Ranganui e te iho nei, kia tikina anō, a tono wā, a tono wāhi, homie, hui, taiki. What that means is, let's suspend our discussion from the ridge line of the sky standing above us to be fetched again at the right time and in the right place. We stand together united. Thank you.